Well, that's a snippet of the Station Strangler documentary produced by Idea Candy, and it looks at one of South Africa's most notorious serial killings that took place between 1986 and 1994 in Mitchell's Plain. A killer was abducting young boys, often close to railway stations, raping and murdering them. For more on the documentary, I'm now joined by Dr. Ian Malcolm, Rijsdijk, Senior Lecturer at the Centre for Film and Media Studies at the University of Cape Town. Doc, a very good morning to you. Thank you so much for making time for us this morning. What do you make of this documentary series? Does it have all of the intrigues when it comes to stories of this nature?
Good morning, Aldrin, and good morning to the viewers. Yes, I think it's a very interesting documentary because it keeps to a lot of the classic tropes of the serial killer documentary, the true crime documentary, but it's also very closely focused on the South African context and particularly the Cape Town context in the way in which it draws in the community, reflects very strongly on the community, not just the kind of gruesome details of the killings.
Yeah, but I have to say the strange thing about this particular documentary is that it is, of course, called the Station Strangler and makes reference to the number of deaths, murders, as well as rapes that have been taking place between 1986 and 1994. But Norman Simons wasn't convicted of all of those murders. And I wonder for an audience and people that are interested in crimes of this nature, how they reconcile. On one end, Simons is convicted for one murder, but not necessarily all of the other murders that he is being linked to or accused of being involved in.
Yeah, it's a common trait in a lot of serial killing cases, and this is true of the United States and other parts of the world as well, that very often killers are not prosecuted or not found guilty of all the crimes because only a limited number can be used in court because of the gathering of evidence. Often your bodies remain undiscovered. And on the other side, killers themselves who are arrested often inflate or boast about how many people they've killed, and a lot of those cases, especially if the victims are marginalized people, the bodies remain undiscovered, and so the true tally or the true number of victims remains unknown. I think in the case of the Station Strangler, what's difficult is that the cases took place in the 1980s. The forensic evidence was at a different stage than it is today, and so the state's case very much hinged off eyewitness accounts and an ability to prosecute for the one case. It's no solace, obviously, for the families of the other 21 victims. And it does obviously open the door, which the film explores, that the idea that Norman Simons might not be guilty, certainly of all of them. Maybe he's only guilty of the murder of Elroy van Rooyen, and maybe there were other killers around at the time. And this documentary, in a way, talks about a discussion that's been alive around the Station Strangler case for some time.
Yeah, another part around this, of course, is does it give us an idea of the state of mind of a serial killer? How they plan the murders, for instance. And one of the points that is raised by Alan Busak in the documentary is that it happens during the time, we know that with the unrest that was taking place in the country, it was a state of emergency. We also know what was happening in terms of race classification and the impact that it has had on the colored population specifically.
I think the film does two things really well. The one is that it looks at the true context of the crimes, as you say, under apartheid. Dr. Busak's a really fantastic interviewee in the film. And this is true of a lot of serial killers in South Africa who remained undetected in the late 80s and early 90s, partially because of evidence gathering, and they were killing in different precincts around the country, but also because they often were preying on marginalized communities that weren't being policed in the same way, for example, as white communities. But I think the other thing the documentary does nicely is it also focuses on what one of the key elements of serial killers, which is their knowledge of their immediate environment. So the shots in the film that return to the scenes of the crime, that go through the dunes in the present day, give us a sense of how serial killers have a very clear understanding of their own environment. They're very intelligent in the way in which they move around their territory. They map the city very differently to the rest of us. So they see possibilities, they see access points, departure points, hiding spaces, in an environment that the rest of us would basically drive past on a daily basis. So it's that idea of the killer, in a way, hiding in plain sight for a long period of time that is quite chilling. But I think the film sort of gives us both that political context and the sort of interior psychology of the killer, whoever it is, I think particularly well.
Yeah, and if we were to fast forward to instance what's happening now in modern day society, specifically now with the Eastern Cape, with the number of serial killings that have been taking place there and mass killings at that as well. I wonder how a documentary like this aids the work of a psychological profiler like Mickey Pistorius in trying to help and assist the police in napping people who are behind these heinous crimes.
I think it's important to distinguish between serial killing and mass killing. Yeah. Firstly, and the fact that serial killing in its true form is actually in decline globally, and there's a number of possible reasons for that. Police intelligence, intelligence gathering is more sophisticated, forensic examinations are more sophisticated. I think the mass killings in the Eastern Cape require a very, very different type of investigation. They're sudden and they seem spontaneous. There's no pattern necessarily to them. They might involve, and this is me speaking not as a criminologist, but as a media scholar, they might involve sort of tensions within communities or family ties. So they're a very, very different prospect from an investigation point of view. And they're no less horrendous, obviously, but they do suggest a different type of investigation. And already there have been arrests which suggest that people in the community know who's perpetrating the crimes. And the same has been true of the spate of kidnappings done in the Eastern Cape by particular syndicates. So I think in the case of organized crimes like that, there's often someone who knows the person involved. What made serial killing, particularly in the 80s and 90s, so terrifying was that the people involved were often very, very normal next door neighbors, and people were unaware of what was actually going on in their community. So I think the way in which the police investigation will go will be slightly different, but it does indicate a different kind of trauma that is unraveling in our society at the moment.
Yeah, and just in conclusion, is from an audience perspective, what is it about heinous crime and crimes of this nature that really intrigue people and say, I want to go and watch? And if you look, for instance, at the work that Idea Candy has been working on, the Rosemary documentary, Rosemary Ndlovu, the women who killed family members to claim insurance money from them, the Thabo Bester matter as well. What is it about crime that people find so fascinating? I know with the US, for instance, there are channels that solely focuses just on crime stories. Not so big here in South Africa, though, but there is an interest.
I think, so the one important point is that I think crime is a way for all of us, and this is a very fundamental human aspect, I think. Crime takes sort of private ideas, private passions, and they become public. So that, the discovery of the crime, the discovery of a murder victim, for example, is the kind of public discovery of often a private narrative. And it's those narratives, those private narratives, that fascinate us. We want to know why, what pushes someone to do such a terrible thing. So I think there's something, and that's true of all crime shows. I think serial killing is obviously at the extreme end of that spectrum of fascination. I think in the South African context, we've, especially emerging out of apartheid, there was very little crime on television for quite a long time in the 90s and 2000s, mainly because we had a lot of American shows doing that, and also because we were still very much invested in our own, coming to terms with our own political past, the political violence of the state. And in a way, it's only in the past 10, 15 years that we're sort of turning our attention to the more sort of domestic aspect of violent crime in South Africa. And the fact that these stories, what's important about true crime stories is they have a kind of inbuilt narrative coherence. You don't have to sort of invent the story because the story is already there. And often, as in the case of someone like Thabo Bester, the truth is stranger than fiction. Yeah. So they're very, very compelling narratives. And they're real. So we are drawn into the idea of a narrative being told to us that has both happened in the past, and then we kind of relive it in the present through the documentary. And I think that's where the fascination comes for the true crime genre and the reason why it's so popular at the moment.
Just a question that came to my mind now. Does it at all have the ability of making the individuals who do follow these type of shows become indifferent to crime itself that happens around them?
It's a very good question, and I suppose it's part of the larger idea behind the question as to whether exposure to violent media creates violence in the viewer or desensitizes us.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of studies that suggest that that there's no direct, there are some studies that will say yes, others that say no. I think that the idea that it necessarily creates violent impulses in the viewer, I think, is probably a weak argument. To the extent that it desensitizes us, I think the content on our TV screens and film screens has transformed so much over the past 20 years anyway that I don't think true crime necessarily worsens that. I think what true crime does do is it does indicate, it indicates to people how procedure works. It's educational in the extent that it allows people to understand how things like this are investigated. There are some arguments that suggest that it even allows, in the podcasting environment, people listening to the shows become more aware of their immediate environment. They perhaps become less likely to become victims of crime because they are listening to these podcasts and they're understanding how criminals think as a result. So there's that argument as well that I've seen in some media spaces.
Yeah, and we've also heard of some people saying that because of following shows like Law and Order, they were able to also accumulate quote-unquote evidence that led to the conviction of a suspect. But thank you so much for that conversation. That is Dr. Ian Malcolm, Rijsdijk, who's a senior lecturer at the Center for Film and Media Studies